Hello, ladies. We're on the module A225. Block 3, Decline in Renewal, 1980 to 1914. Edited by Robin Mackie. Page 192. Unit 19, Popular Culture, Identity and the Lived Experience of the Working Class. Organised leisure. One of the most striking features of popular leisure culture in the period 1880-1914 was the rise of leisure activities organised by clubs, associations and societies. People got together to organise myriad activities. They started sports teams, formed drama groups and rambling societies, joined choirs and brass bands, organised pigeon races and so on. Competition had been a constant feature of popular leisure in previous centuries, and this continued to be reflected in many of these activities. Even beyond the obvious example of sports, for instance, there was estimated 40,000. Hang on. 40,000 brass bands in UK by the early 20th century, Daunton 2007, and along with choral societies which could conclude both men and women. Oh, hang on, bear with me. Anyway, to 12,800 and by 1903 to 20,000. The 1905 FA Cup final between Aston Villa and Newcastle United was attended by more than 100,000 people. English First Division matches were also attended. The year 1908 to 1909 recorded 6 million spectators and an average crowd of 16,000. Spectating itself was a form of active, meaningful entertainment. Games provided an exciting break from dull, repetitive factory work. The gathering of large crowds to support local teams fostered a sense of belonging and identity among industrial workers, many of whom were relatively new migrants to urban areas. This new identity was symbolically embodied in scarves, team songs, and local sporting heroes, and it fed the enthusiastic, often raucous support demonstrated from home teams. The enthusiasm of football supporters could also turn into violence, which took a number of forms: pitch invasions, rioting, fights between supporters of opposing teams, and assaults on players and referees, but such incidents were underreported. It is difficult to estimate their frequency, but local newspapers provided useful qualitative information. For example, the Leicester Daily Mercy reported on April 1899 match between Greenock Morton and Port Glasgow in the following terms. When the Port Glasgow team began losing, their partitions became turbulent, and several free fights took place. At the close, the Port Glasgow followers broke into the enclosure and assaulted the Morton players and also the police on duty at the ground. In a few minutes, the row assumed the proportions of a riot, and extra police were telephoned for. On the arrival of mounted police, the constables were forced to use their batons freely. But the riot continued for over 2 hours. 19 constables were injured, some of them seriously. A number of spectators were also injured. The east end of Greenock was in a state of panic for a time. When the riot was at its height, shopkeepers closed their places of business. Such reports were not uncommon, and some relayed even more violent episodes, which suggests that the levels of everyday violence at football games were high. The behaviour of the supporters was condemned by middle-class observers, and football crowds were routinely characterised as being rowdy and disorderly, but football fans were not bothered by ideas of middle-class respectability, at least in this particular context. For them, the violence often attached to football was invested with complex meanings, from assertions of masculinity to what has been called a quest for excitement. Edas and Dunning, 1986. While support for team sports fostered one form of social cohesion, it is important to note that participants were not a homogeneous social grouping reflecting the working class. Sports was certainly a way to bring people together, but in other ways, they also reflected entrenched cultural and social divisions. Early clubs had strong social and geographical roots, often bringing together men from the same mill or from the same neighbourhood through football. Participants and spectators recreated additional parish, town, or county rivalries that had been characterised popular entertainment in previous centuries. Football also served to entrench social division within the working class, especially between skilled and unskilled workers, as the latter were often discouraged from joining local teams. In the same way, the poorest people were kept from games by the price of admission, while women were sometimes granted free admittance to football games in hope it would exercise a claiming influence on rowdy crowds. Football also remained an overwhelmingly male occupation, as did all organised sports. Like other sporting activities, football was often promoted by middle class reformists as a way to tame the working class, and by religious promoters as a way to win adherents. Yes, it is far from a passive activity. Working class participants gradually appropriated the sport, founding their own clubs, as in the case of the Newton Health Team, depicted in 19.5, or reclaiming teams from themselves. For example, in Bolton, the Christchurch Football Club was started by an Anglican clergyman, but within 4 years the team had walked out form the Bolton Wanderers. As the popularity of football grew among working class communities, northern clubs increasingly compensated their players for even recruiting paid players. The English Football Association accepted professionalism in 1885 and Scotland followed in 1893. But many young men also continued to play the game as leisure activity. There were about 12,000 clubs and 750,000 registered players in England in 1914. Dalton 2007. All in all, however, the conjunction of professionalism, mass spectatorship, and commercialisation meant that the middle class largely withdrew from football, and the sport grew into both a means of enjoyment and a source of pride and identity for the working class. Organised sports in Ireland. The story of organised sports in Ireland is a little different, but also shows how sport was at the intersection of a number of different identities, including class and regional, or in this case, national identities. British sports such as football, cricket, and rugby were introduced in Ireland in the second half of the 19th century, but didn't make much impact outside the large urban centres and the Protestant upper classes. What's the door? Establishment, sporting landscape change. Method established for the Gaelic Athletic Association (GAA) in 1884. The association was part of the Gaelic Revival, a movement of culture and nationalism that revived interest in Irish language and Gaelic culture. The GAA promoted the practice of ancient sports such as hurling, Gaelic football, Gaelic handball, and Gaelic athletics. Within 5 years, it had 777 affiliated clubs with over 41,000 members across Ireland. Mick Elliott, 2016. Its success is ascribed to its ability to reproduce the structures and practices that polarised organised sports in Britain, while also appealing to Ireland's particular social and cultural context. especially a strong Irish culture and nationalist movement after 1900. Nevertheless, from 1890s, the GAA also had to compete with increasing popularity of football, especially among the working class of Ulster. Unit 19.3 Politics and Association. In the previous section, you learned that there were two sides to the new working class culture of leisure. One was driven by consumption and mass culture, and the other by participation in clubs, societies, and associations. Now the focus will turn to one particular aspect of this culture. This section examines the working class associational culture, that aims to improve the welfare of ordinary people and suggests that it played a role in the emergence of new working class political culture. While you have already encountered examples of working class political activity early in the 19th century, most notably Chartism. It was the period 1880-1914 that you saw crystallisation of an assertive and self-aware working class political culture. However, this is not a simple, straightforward narrative of newly united working people asserting their class identity and political right. Working class associational culture often exclude many members of the working class, especially those who were not skilled male workers. Which is why the story of working class associational culture is also one of the social and gender divisions. It has already been mentioned that sporting clubs excluded, formally or informally, certain types of workers, especially at the beginning of the period. Women were barred not only from joining most sporting clubs, but also from many other popular societies in response. As you saw below, they resorted to starting their own female branches of established societies, their own networks and their own associations. Jacqueline Sarsby, Women Pottery Workers at Work, located at the end unit. This is another extract from Sarsby's oral history of the Staffordshire potteries. Read the interviews carefully. What distinctions are made between the workers in the decorating end and the clay end of the pottery factories? The skilled workers in the decorating end think of themselves as poshers or more respectable than the workers in the clay end, who are perceived to be loud and vulgar. They also are more. The workers in the clay end agree that the decorators are posh, but perhaps use the term in a more negative way. One interviewee calls them pretentious, and clay workers appear to resent being looked down on. We may note that the interviewees were not yet adults in 1914 and also describing work experiences from the interwar years. Although these are similar to the pre-war situation, one of the limitations of oral history is that it relies on memories of living witnesses, and a few people remember the 1910s would have been alive when Sarsby conducted her research. Many working class organisations aim to improve the welfare of working people in some ways. This is rather similar to the middle class efforts to encourage entertainment. Discussed earlier, in fact, because it's often consciously aimed to offer an alternative to traditional artisan culture associated in contemporary's mind with drinking, violence and idleness. Working class associational culture has sometimes been interpreted by historians as working people borrowing and reproducing middle class norms. However, in practice, it is very distinct from the paternalistic top-down approach adopted by middle class reformists. It was a lived culture which grew out of existing local and professional networks, spurred on by the purposive of the political, the pious, and the self-improving minorities in the working class. You already encountered some examples of working class association in this unit. Men who knew each other from the workplace or from a local pub would organise sports games, excursions, brass bands, and many other leisure activities. Now the focus returns to those clubs and associations that directly aim to improve the moral and economic conditions of working people via trade unions, chapels, cooperatives, and so on. This rich associational life was identified by contemporary observers as cradles of citizenship. independence, mutual assistance, and social reform, and some historians see in its effects the first middle-class political culture in British history. Trade unions are perhaps the best known for working-class association, and by their very nature, they illustrate the growing agency of working class in the period, including political agency, since unions increasingly attempted to further their goals via elections and politics, which eventually led to the rise of the Labour Party. In the early mid-19th century, unions had traditionally organised skilled artisans. Such unions fought normally excluded unskilled workers, who were perceived as a threat to their number of members, status and wages. You may remember the Bradford Wool Combers from Unit 3, also the discussion of Glasgow labour market in Unit 17, and a high hurdle noted to exit between unskilled and skilled workers. However, in the years 1880-1914, unions grew and expanded their membership as a new type of unionism, imaginatively called New Unionism, started bringing together unskilled and semi-skilled workers such as dockers, seamen and gas workers. The new unions rose to prominence in the late 1800s with a series of strikes, including London Dock Strike of 1889, the National Agricultural Labourers Union, a trade union representing farm workers, founded in 1870 by Joseph Ark, 1826 to 1919, also saw a rise in recruitment, especially in Norfolk. Following the success of London Dock Strike, traditional unions also usually excluded women, who represented both an economic since for superior breadwinner's wage. In addition, women often worked in sectors while trade organisations such as agriculture and domestic services, still the largest sector of female employment in 1914. Some women did attempt to challenge the status quo and to organise trade unions for women, such as the Women's Protective and Provident League found by Emma Patterson, 1848-1886. In 1874, which became the Women's Trade Union League in 1903, some such unions were led by middle-class women. Patterson was the daughter of a school headmaster who gained trade union experience by working as assistant secretary in a working men's club. Others were organised and led by female workers themselves, for example, the Dundee and District Mill and Factory Operatives Union was formed in 1885, followed the strike of women employed in Dundee's textile industry. One of the most iconic strikes of the period was that by London Match Girls in 1888. Ben Tillett, The Help Yourself Gospel, 1911, located at the end unit, listening from an address delivered to the striking dockers of Dundee. Ben Tillett, 1860-1943, was a new union leader who played a prominent role in the successful London Dock Strike of 1889. In 1911 to 12, he was again involved in a series of dock strikes. According to Tillett, what makes for a successful trade unionist movement? Tillett believes that union members should be sober, determined, and courageous. The reference to a Salvation Captain will become clearer when you read the next subsection of the Salvation Army. He also believes that unions should appeal to our women, to our children. They are not only a political tool, but also a social community with roots in family culture. Our women should also be enthusiastic and will sing Labour songs and tell the story of Labour to the child as she nestles in it in our arms. Tillett's discussion of trade union principles echoed new ideals of respectability, as opposed to traditional perception of artisan culture as being pub and drink centred. The fact that he was addressing dockers also illustrates the efforts of new unionism to broaden union membership. Tillett even attempted to include women, although he clearly expected some level of resistance from his audience. Interestingly, Dundee actually had a comparative high female employment rate due to its jute industry, and, as you saw above, the female textile workers even had their own unions, but Tillett didn't mention this. Nevertheless, the broadcasting of union membership had its limits. Even by 1914, it is unlikely that more than 20% of manual workers were unionised, while the number of women trade unions did increase. By 1914, only some female workers were organised, most of whom worked in textile industry or in teaching and clerical jobs, but trade unions were far from the only type of working class association that flourished at the turn of the century. To illustrate the wide of this associational culture, this section will explore two other examples. The Salvation Army and the Cooperative Movement. Like trade unions, these two organisations show that the agency demonstrated by working people was shaped by many cultural experiences beyond that of class, including social, gender and religious identities. Salvation Army was a working class movement that sought to improve the lives of its members, but its method and philosophy were very different. It was a charitable association and a church that based its practice on the religious heritage of Methodism. You may remember from the unit Religion, Revival and Reform, Unit 11 and Block 2.